Welcome again to the Startup Society's podcast. Today we're joined by Elliot Roth. He's the founder of Spira, and he's a space geek and biologist. You might be asking, what does that have to do with startup societies? Well, I'm going to let Elliot answer that question. Elliot, can you let our audience know how we met and how you got interested and involved in startup society type projects?
So I met Joe back in 2017 when I volunteered at the Startup Society's conference, and I just show up and start bumping elbows with all of these crazy startup-oriented governmental folks, crypto enthusiasts, and party with them, have a great time with them, and really get into the mix. And part of what drew me to Startup Societies in the first place was being a seasteading ambassador. And I was a seasteading ambassador for a while. And so I was following the work of Joe Quirk, another, of the great Joes out there, and decided to kind of like listen to the talk on seasteading and how it related to startup societies, and came to discover all this stuff about special economic zones, all this great thing about, independent cities and nation states and other things like that. But what really kind of drew me in was the intersection of what I do in terms of technology development and how that would enable new cities to form, and how that would enable really like experimental governmental structures, things like that, out there, either on the ocean, which is what initially pulled me in, or really in developing these sort of economic environments where like new business can flourish.
Could you give us an example of what you mean by that?
Sure thing. So when I first started out working, I was obsessed with the idea that DNA is kind of like the coding language of life. And so you can take DNA and you can program these little tiny self-replicating machines that are known as cells as a means of doing work for you. And they can solve, like really astoundingly, they can solve some pretty massive problems when you set these self-replicating machines in motion. And so initially, what I was really curious about was, well, how do we solve people's basic needs? And that involves like food, water, shelter, those kind of basic necessities that you have, because by doing that, by moving past scarcity, you limit and you kind of eliminate any sort of potential for human conflict. If you really deal with all of the basic needs of people, there's very little reason for you to enter into conflict with your neighbors. And so it's a very like utopian style idea where what if you could produce everything that you needed in a tiny amount of space for no money whatsoever, no resources, just what's around you. And so how I got into that in the first place is kind of wild. When I was in school, I studied biomedical engineering. I was on trajectory to do like an MD, PhD, go full on, like, sciencey. And I had this kind of grad student advisor who I would show up in the lab and he'd make me wash dishes, and then we would take my experiment ideas and use them as his own. It was very hierarchical. And so I got
like
kind of like
academia.
yeah. I was like, screw this system. I don't want to be a part of it. And I wound up trying to start my own lab. So we built it in a garage space, all sorts of medical equipment, scientific equipment, whatnot, packed it full of stuff. It was probably over $500,000 worth of equipment we collected in the span of 3 years for virtually no money, all of it broken in some way and had to fix it up. And so using that laboratory as a basis of foundation, I started fiddling around with different experimental ideas, ranging from, what are some concepts around human genetic engineering, all the way to how do we actively grow houses for people using mushrooms? So like full spectrum of possibilities. And all of these sci-fi ideas stemmed from my love of science fiction and kind of looking at biology as a means of taking science fiction and turning it into science fact. And
I need you to back up for a moment.
Sure.
Did you say you could grow a house with mushrooms?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this has been done before. Mushrooms, particularly the root structure of mushrooms, are stronger pound for pound than concrete. And they're also incredibly porous. And so when I was looking at, how might we go about creating, houses and shelter for people, how might we build on the ocean? One of the core concepts of that was, could you grow floating platforms? Could you actively use the microplastics in the ocean bloom together and form these floating forms as a means of having people live on? And me and my current co-founder, we started investigating the use of mushrooms as a building material to replace ceramic, like ceramic concrete, things like, and starting do some material research on, can you grow floating platforms out of waste materials? And we were relatively successful, but what we soon found out is that there's not much money in building materials, just basic building blocks, bricks, things like that. So that kind of killed the project over a certain period of time.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question. Is this cheap to do?
Yeah. So it's relatively cheap to do. The issue is scale, right? And so that kind of the issue with biology is that you have things that grow really cost effectively, but you need to compete with existing dominant market players. So like if a brick is a fraction of a penny, you need to be able to produce at a fraction of a penny,
Right.
So in addition, there's regulations and standards that are put in place by government that make it really difficult to experiment with some of the cutting edge pieces of technology. And that's what drew me to thing was mostly from especially after going to a conference like Startup Societies. How do you utilize the or oceans to filter as means of regulatory barriers and requirements to prove out new technologies? And so I got really interested in stuff like human genetic engineering, different cutting edge ideas, being able to current cradle beyond the current ability of as a means of preparing us for life in the universe and outside of what we normally can do.
Elliot, Francisco, would you mind editing this part out real quick? My internet's not doing so hot, so let me connect to the one that's closer to the router. It'll be 2 seconds. I'm sorry about that. All right, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, great. Okay, excellent. That was all fantastic. I didn't mean to interrupt the flow of all of it. No. I'm not saying no, definitely not. So yeah, that might have disrupted the flow a little bit, but let's take it down the route of what you were saying. So
enabling life in the universe is kind of what I was trying to lead into. All those technologies, all those sort of cutting edge science experiments and means of really engineering humans or trying to figure out a way that humanity can evolve stem from this idea of sort of like transhumanism, this concept of biohacking, things of that nature, where I was taking all of this lab equipment in this garage space and working on cutting edge concepts. And by doing that, what ended up happening though is I was so focused on that work that I ran out of money. And I wound up faced with a choice. Either I moved into my parents' basement or I figure it out. And so what I wound up doing was I started growing algae as a means of feeding myself. And that kind of became my mainstay. I would eat algae out of these aquarium tanks that I was growing and take big scoops. And that was my main protein intake. So algae doubles every single day, and it is mostly protein by weight. And so with probably about, I think at that time I had 10 aquarium tanks, I could feed myself indefinitely on algae as my main food source.
That is equally horrible and beautiful. Yeah, like you hear all the time about coders that live off of Soylent in order to live, but you're going one step further. You're literally growing your food source.
Right.
But
right.
So you're doing this more than extending your burn rate. You turn this into a company, right?
Right. Yeah. So the idea with the algae was I pretty soon became like a fervent believer that algae is the main food source, the main method of producing the things that we need. And I kind of proved it on the nature of me surviving on it, being able to eat algae and just kind of
talk about a perfect concept.
Right. And so after a couple of months, I was like, yo, everybody needs to eat algae. I don't know why it's everywhere. Like, this is wild. And that's how I actively came back into the Startup Societies network too, because I was looking for ways to apply our like algae growing technology for these extreme environments, enclosed spaces, living out on the ocean, not much in the way of resources. What you can do is you can recycle a lot of waste, feed that waste to the algae, and then eat the algae as a means of supporting yourself.
So there are so many questions from an entrepreneurial perspective that would be very important, but I think for the users and myself, the question is, how does it taste, and why is it, and how do you make it taste good?
Yes, yeah. So that became the main focus because I realized that was the limitation, right?
Yeah.
People are unwilling to eat strange things like algae, things like that, because of the taste. And what I found was fresh algae has no taste. It's practically flavorless. It's really weird. It's kind of like a eureka moment. And what I soon realized was that only during degradation, only during like oxidation and processing, when it breaks down, do you get those like bad tasting umami, bitter sort of flavors that you associate with umami, like seaweed, things like that, right?
Yeah.
And so what my team started to work on are two different things. So the first was trying to genetically engineer that algae so that it produced either novel flavors. So you can make it taste like, I don't know, clementines, oranges, you can make it taste like bananas. You can make it taste like all sorts of different things. Or alternatively, you knock out those bad tastes so that they don't occur anymore in the end organism. And then the second thing that we ended up realizing is that if you pull out the pigment, what you're left with is like this really great protein that doesn't have those flavors associated with it. It's just kind of like this protein powder. It's pretty bland that plant-based milk and meat companies really love. They really, really want to use it.
Wait, so the flavor comes from the pigment?
Yeah. So when you eat spinach, the main component of that like irony kind of bitter
The
taste that
chlorophyll.
yes, exactly.
Okay.
So the degradation of the chlorophyll, all of the pigmentation in fruits and vegetables, what happens when it sits out, that oxidizes and it gets bad, and it kind of is like apples going brown. Over time, it starts degrading, and that releases those like metallic umami style flavors that make it taste bad. And so by pulling out the pigment, you're left with a protein, and then you're left with this brilliant blue pigment. And then working with other types of algae, we can do a whole rainbow of natural colors.
Okay, so have you found a product market fit with all of it? It sounds like there is, and it's incredible, to be honest. And you told me about this, but I haven't realized the plethora of possibilities there.
Right. So the color we focus on right now is blue, and it's because there's not many things in nature that are blue, giving us like a really unique advantage. And blue is normally people's favorite color. And so we can do everything from Gatorade to blue jeans, right? And anything in between. And so anything blue that you see around you, that's what we're trying to get to. Because what people don't really realize, and inadvertently we kind of support this, is that the colors that we use in our day-to-day lives, whether it's the foods we eat, the like things we put on our skin or clothes we wear, what we use to dye those things it's petrochemical based. It's all petroleum based. It's all kind of like produced in giant factories that emit tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, really pollute not only our local environment, but also like contribute to negative health effects.
That's very interesting. And that can be a huge market. I mean, a lot of the early United States cash crops, I mean, obviously there was cotton, it was, indigo. Indigo was a thing.
Yeah.
It could still be the case. Very interesting.
Yeah. So indigo right now is produced synthetically and using like petroleum-based precursors. And it's a nasty process that pollutes local waterways in Bangladesh, leading to tons of different diseases, disorders, things like that. And so for us, I mean, like our main objective is replacing all of the petrochemical based dyes with a carbon negative algae based alternative. And so that's like red dye, blue dye, yellow dye, a full rainbow of colors.
Wow.
And so that's kind of what we're doing first, because you don't really need a lot of dye and it goes a long way. But beyond that, I mean, the byproduct of all of that is leftover protein. And so that protein is really great for plant-based milk and meat companies. And so you mentioned Soylent before. This caught the attention of the founder of Soylent, who actually invested in our company. And so we're actively working with Rob, who's the founder of Soylent, as well as other folks in the industry, particularly in the food space, as a means of replacing these more harmful animal-based proteins and petrochemical-based dyes from the supply chain.
Wow, you cannot get more Silicon Valley than that. And I do not mean that in a bad way. It's
been a fun process, but more so like what what it pertains to like startup societies and things like that are some of the technology that we're working on now. So as a company, we're still consistently growing. We've actually had a break-even point recently, which is really exciting. We are now consistently delivering ingredients to customers, and how we actually produce those ingredients are working with farmers all over the world. And these farms are in mostly like desert impoverished regions. So we support these farmers in developing countries, kind of purchase the algae from them and then process it using our proprietary process. So they kind of cultivate our seed strains and cultures and then send us the raw materials to process.
Query.
Yeah.
Doesn't algae require a lot of water? Isn't it better for the farms to be located near the ocean or near bodies of water?
Yeah. So sometimes they often are located next to water, but what we found is that because algae only requires the amount of water you start with, it doesn't require any more than that. It's actually pretty good as a crop to consistently farm in desert regions, because as long as you maintain and buffer the water without evaporation, you just make sure that you maintain the water levels. You don't need any additional water in your growing process than what you start with.
Okay, interesting. So if you run something like a seastead, you would be able to produce enormous amounts
Right.
of algae.
Exactly. There's not much limit to out on the ocean, something like that. You could either grow in bags. You could also use other varieties of like macro algae, like kelp and other things like that, as a means of producing pigments and proteins and things of that nature. And so that's kind of what we're developing technology for now, and what I came back from a simulated lunar mission in conjunction with the International Moon Base Alliance and High Seas in Hawaii about. And so that was a fun time.
So you kind of just ran past that. That's something that needs to be discussed more. He was audience members. Elliot was in a simulated moon base in Hawaii for a while, testing his technology. That's huge. I'll let you take the mic.
So for a period of 2 weeks, I lived with 5 strangers, mostly strangers, in a habitat that was 35 feet across. It looked like a golf ball from the outside, like half of a golf ball, geodesic dome with an attached shipping container. And this kind of extreme environment was in the lava fields of Hawaii on the side of Mauna Loa on the Big Island. And it is seriously like 8,000, 9,000 feet up in the air. And you look around and there's nothing. It's blackened lava fields all around you, no vestiges of civilization or anything like that. And what we ended up finding out and discovering is that in this enclosed space, it's one of the most perfect environments to begin producing stuff like algae, because it enables us to kind of produce and consume different forms of food products, ingredients, proteins, things of that nature. So what we did, sorry for the background noise. Can you hear that?
That's fine. Francisco, if there's anything we can do about that, that's fine. And great.
Hold on.
We're good. Oh.
It's my roommate. He's blending a smoothie in the exact wrong time.
Does it have algae?
Normally it does. Normally it does. He adds spirulina into his smoothies. So anyways, so I was living on the side of a volcano in Hawaii in a simulated lunar environment. This was a half golf ball looking like thing, a geodesic dome that was 35 feet across, with 5 strangers, half of whom had advanced degrees and PhDs, who worked in conjunction with NASA. And while in that kind of habitat environment, what I discovered was that algae was perfectly suited to grow in that kind of space.
So that by itself is cool. But now I'm thinking of the governance of 5 type A highly intelligent individuals and the types of conflict and conflict resolution that's necessary there. Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah. So luckily we had an amazing crew, and those sort of type A individuals, the kind of people that would go into space, are very high performing. And really exceptional. So they ranged from, astrobiology, mechanical engineering, systems engineering, different sorts of expertise ranging from like electrical engineering, very, very adept people at really existing in these kind of extreme environments. And when you have those super high performing people, you expect conflict. But for some reason, our crew was just really well put together. It was a good balance of, safety, caution, but also like risk, innovation, things like that. We collaborated really well. And so all in all, I was really pleasantly surprised. It was only 2 weeks though. And so what this kind of tests out, and normally in this sort of environment, it tests out long duration missions. I was lucky in the sense that I got to do this partially because of the pandemic. It was pretty much a once in a lifetime opportunity where they've shortened a lot of their mission durations to 2 weeks. And so now they're doing 6 to 12 missions in rotation in this kind of environment for 2 weeks at a time. And so they kind of look for cutting edge experiments to run in this sort of space. And I had 12 different experiments ranging from psychology to different engineering projects to company sponsored projects. And of course, my algae related experiments that I ran in this environment. So it was a jam-packed 2 weeks.
Did you do a spacewalk?
Yeah, so part of the rules of the environment is that you have to act like you're on the moon. We had a time delay associated with communication. There was limited access to internet, and so we really could only use what internet we requested from mission control. We had to make do with whatever tools we had around us. The habitat itself is a closed environment, and so it had a problem with the CO2 pump initially that led to elevated levels of CO2. And so you would like kind of wake up with a little woozy from a headache from CO2. But luckily I was growing algae in this environment and sucked up tons of CO2. So over the course of 2 weeks, it got better and better over time.
You might have saved everyone. I remember there was some sort of lunar or Mars experiment where people went crazy because of like a certain level, was it CO2 or something like that, was released, and that altered the whole social relations in a very negative way?
Well, what some experiments have shown is that elevated levels of CO2 make people more agitated, more aggressive, and dumber overall.
Okay.
And so as global warming contributes more and more to elevated levels of CO2 in the environment, I mean, now we're at like 440
that explains a lot.
parts per million, right?
That explains 2020.
It gets worse and worse and worse.
Aggravated, dumb.
Yep. And so I'm really hopeful for the day when we're producing tons and tons of algae as a means of sucking down CO2 from the environment. And so that's really what I'm aiming for. And something we discovered, particularly on this mission, was that it really is a lifesaver in that kind of environment.
We need more algae. That's
right.
What I'm getting out of this.
I mean, like the way that it relates to these sort of startup societies is like, what happens if you have an environment that is out in the middle of nowhere, whether it's on the ocean or in a place where it's really inhospitable or inaccessible, someplace that other people don't necessarily want, where you're trying to develop the local environment. And how do you go about doing that? Well, you can use more extreme species and organisms and create something really specialized for that space. I mean, for us, we had a limited amount of water supply too. We could only have 30 seconds of water a day. We had 250 gallons split between 6 people over the course of 2 weeks. And so that was it. That was it for water. We had solar power to charge the battery banks, composting toilets, the whole 9 yards, and freeze-dried food. And so having fresh algae as a means of getting that kind of like protein intake and growing something that was feeding the crew felt really good.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, like they talk about in seasteads, I mean, obviously you're going to be trading a lot as a seastead. That's kind of one of the points. But it's still the cost of growing your own food. I mean, getting food in is higher. So it makes sense to have your own food source, and what's better than that. But yeah, I hadn't really thought of it like that. You have all these images of that Matt Damon movie, Martian, or something like that.
Yeah.
They spend a bunch of money saving Matt Damon. They're probably spending way more resources than necessary because of it sounds like algae is a lot more effective than growing grains, for instance.
Right. Yeah.
And That's very interesting. Or even the spaceship, like, because of a trip to Mars, that's going to be like a year and a
It's going
half
to
or
take,
something.
yeah, it's going to take a long time. So, I mean, we've gotten now offers to fly payloads into space to kind of like test our technology. So,
Wow.
algae in space, Spira in space.
Wow.
And like the cool part, the really interesting part about being in that moon habitat was the fact that in that sort of extreme environment, in our simulation, we had to wear spacesuits to go outside the hab. So we would dress up in full head to toe helmet, air pack, gloves, boots, knee pads, everything, spacesuit. And we were tasked by NASA Goddard to investigate these lava tubes and use LiDAR to map out these lava tubes deep underground in these labyrinth like environments and kind of take samples of what would be living down there. And the idea is that in those sort of extreme environments, that's where we would set up on the moon and Mars. And so something like that is kind of like a really good analogy to seasteads, to sort of like startup societies in more extreme environments where you would try to build something of value where there isn't, you know?
Absolutely. And so algae definitely has a lot of ways that it relates to seasteading, but
Right,
you've actually worked on floating projects directly and even
right.
worked with sort of a blue economy accelerator. Can you go through those parts of your strange and beautiful career with us?
So Spira is located in Los Angeles, and we are one of the first members of Altacy, which is a giant blue economy incubator here in town. It is this massive space that really relates companies to the ocean, and it has immediate ocean access in the port of LA. It's kind of in this interesting free trade zone. It's an opportunity zone. Has the ability for companies to really set up in a really low cost way as a means of getting access to the benefits of the ocean and the benefits of one of the largest, the largest port in the United States, if not one of the largest ports in the world. So it brings in about 33% of all goods enter the United States through this port. And it just processes a ton of stuff that everyday people use in the United States. So we were lucky enough to get access to Altacy through a partnership with Braid Theory, one of our partners, and be able to really set up shop here, build a shipping container laboratory where we conduct a lot of our experiments, and kind of investigate how we can interface in the best possible way with the blue economy and marine economy.
That's super cool.
Mhm.
And are you allowed to talk about sort of your jumpstart, quick start efforts in conjunction with Alta Sea?
Yeah, yeah. So some of these things are kind of like in conjunction with the local city environment and chief innovation officer here and things like that. So we're located in the city of San Pedro, which is a really nice sort of beachside town that oftentimes like has all of the dock workers that live here, and so they live here and then they work at the docks, and so it's kind of like a lower income environment. It's definitely in this opportunity zone neighborhood, and it's a free trade zone as well in certain areas, and so there's a lot of flexibility associated with setting up stacked SEZ. There's a military base here, there's like all sorts of special jurisdictions, and so we've started investigating different ways to enable more fluidity, more free trade, the ability to set up like an actual SEC in the United States. And, we're starting to make headway in that realm. I also think that it gives us the opportunity to establish some really interesting companies here. So if you take a look around Los Angeles, you have a lot of aerospace companies that set up shop here. You have a lot of biotech, surprisingly, that sets up shop here, entertainment. And so I've been taking a look at, how do we enable medical seasteads off the coast of Los Angeles. There's a large contingent population of very wealthy individuals and elderly who are looking for access to sort of medical technology, other things like that. The pandemic has really helped accelerate that. I worked with a startup on building automated robotic shipping container diagnostic facilities during the pandemic. And so being able to accelerate that process of delivering healthcare on the ocean, that's really exciting, as opposed to taking trips down to Tijuana, which is about 2 hours away from here. It's a lot better to take just like a cruise out. Second thing that we're starting to kind of take a look at is how do you expand upon the regulatory environment for enabling things like, for example, SpaceX to launch rockets offshore. And so there is precedent for that. There was a company called Sea Launch that was based in Long Beach, which is the town right next door to us, that actually launched rockets offshore out in the ocean. And so stuff like that kind of enables you to have a localized transportation system. Hyperloop is based here. And so you have the ability to really bring goods and services to and from the port quite quickly, as well as people. And it's only getting better. And so it's really interesting to see this local innovative ecosystem come together. And I think that some of the tenets of startup societies, like special economic zones, would really resonate in this sort of space.
That's super cool. So, I mean, let's imagine that you are you are a startup society entrepreneur, but let's say that you are an entrepreneur that specifically has an agreement with the government, and that government says, okay, you get to change certain rules to make things more attractive for innovative medical therapies in this area, whether that's floating or whether that's land-based. What type of things would you address to bring innovative companies to do good things there?
Yeah. I think part of it is the limitations and the safety limitations that the FDA oftentimes puts on medical therapies, which makes complete sense in the normal context of delivering medicine to millions of people, right? Now, outside of that context, in the sense of like this is a life or death situation, putting limitations on access to therapeutics and drugs makes absolutely no sense. Like you're going to die unless you try something out. And so being able to extend the usage of certain drugs and the ability for people to gain access to those, that's really the kind of environment and picture that I would kind of paint in this sort of realm. For example, like the right to try, the right to try, the right to try new medical therapies, other things like that. And I think the lessening of the regulatory oversight burden and hurdles that companies have to face in terms of delivering these therapeutics to people, especially if the only other option is like you either try this or you die. And so something that's curious to me is extending that out to see that like human life is finite. And so at the end of the road, you either try something or you die in 100% of the cases, right? Like that's one of the truths of life. You're going to die. And so being able to experiment with longevity oriented technology as a means of extending the life of people around the area, investing in kind of like insurance-based technology that enables that as well, and different sorts of financial systems. So there is like a really interesting crypto community down here that kind of got set up. And so taking a look at like fintech, Coinbase is based in Malibu around the corner from us. So being able to explore the full spectrum of possibilities when it comes to health systems, whether that is, access to new medical technology to try out new therapies, extending upon human lifespan longevity, new ways of insuring and financing different sorts of medical technologies as a means of expanding upon what it means to really live and thrive. Some of the more interesting technologies that are being investigated in LA have to do with the brain as well. So like, what's the point of living a really long life if you don't have a healthy brain? And so you have companies like Kernel, located in Santa Monica, and Neuralink really digging into that and trying to find out ways of expanding upon human possibility, potentially even augmenting human neuronal activity, and trying to see how far we can really push what it means to be human to enter into this next phase of development, of looking at, how do we enable human flourishing, and how do we solve for a lot of the problems and the scarcity that's around us.
Yeah, I like that point. I know that doesn't sound much about startup studies, but there's a lot of transhumanists that talk about how they want to live forever. I could definitely imagine a scenario where every moment becomes a little less meaningful, or
Yeah.
everyone that remains is a little bit more insufferable. Mix of the two. So probably need to solve a couple of soft problems before the hard
Well,
problems. forever.
I think like the key point of it, and this is something I'm working on with some friends of mine. There's a network of these independent laboratories spread out now across the world, and so started collaborating with a couple of friends on more of like a biological frontiers foundation, something that enables biological civil liberties. So like the Electronic Frontiers Foundation enabled electronic civil liberties. The idea that you have a more like a biological bill of rights, the right to die is a part of that. The right to choose when your life ends should be a part of that. And so like that's the thing, is like we don't have that choice right now. We have this biological determinism, and part of my work in terms of solving for humans' basic needs is figuring out what can kill you first, right? So like air is 3 minutes, water is 3 days, food is 3 weeks. Taking a look at those things and removing that sort of fear enables human flourishing, and kind of it enables us to move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs to self-actualization. And I think that startup societies is a really good group that enables belonging and human flourishing by enabling economic activity, really. And so that's part of the reason why I'm a part of startup societies in the first place.
So you made a really meaningful statement, and I'm going to follow it up with an even more important question and a more meaningful question. So you're describing gene therapies and floating. Are you trying to make Bioshock?
No, well, I really hope that it doesn't become Rapture or anything like that. That would be
So that's the important question. How do you prevent rapture?
Right. So what really terrifies me about this talk of medical technology is the diffusion of access to new technologies. To me, is one of the most terrifying things about the world we live in right now. When you have a stratification of wealth and access to certain resources, particularly in the United States, where the top 1% owns, I don't know, like 60, 70%, more than half of the wealth of the United States, like that to me blows my mind. And so that stratification of access oftentimes leads to almost a speciation effect, where the wealthy are able to do more and become almost godlike in their ability to do whatever the hell they want. And so to me, core to my philosophy and values is enabling access, particularly to these emerging scientific concepts, technologies, things like that, for the bottom billion, for people that are without, kind of working with our farmers to enable access just to basic needs like food, like what we're doing with our algae. But going beyond that, we've built laboratories, these kind of like mobile shipping container labs. Our first one is here in LA in this shipping container that we've been using, but opening up access to the community and teaching people in the community that would not have otherwise have access to these tools of scientific discovery and literacy, kind of going into the inner city and opening it up so that somebody who has never encountered these sort of scientific questions is able to find out things about their local environment. Things like, what is my water like? What is the water quality? Are these pipes actively poisoning me, or like local air quality, or like genetic information in my DNA and things like that, where it opens up a realm of possibility where you're able to ask questions and get real answers, and then enable access to things like this sort of life extension technology and things that we're talking about.
Making the personal computer of genetic engineering.
Right. And that's sort of the entire ethos of what my company really is trying to do with algae. Is you can use algae as sort of that biocomputer. The idea that you can program it to produce the sort of things that you want means that you can have localized production. The dream is to pull like Jean-Luc Picard and press a button and be like Earl Grey tea hot and have my algae brew it as a replicator in front of me,
So I am a complete uneducated idiot when it comes to biology, but from what I've heard, a good part about gene editing requires some sort of bacteria to essentially poop out different proteins in order to make things happen. Could you enable that through algae?
Yeah. So you actually hit it pretty spot on the head. Like that's if anybody's taking a basic biology class, it basically goes DNA is the language. It's like a coding language. It's the input, and it's the information, the instructions that you need the cell to produce proteins which go and like do things, and those proteins are kind of like the builders, or they're the information shuttlers, or they form a variety of different functions. But just what's important to realize about proteins is that they do things in the body, in these cells, in organisms, in the world. Practically everything you see around you was built using proteins in some fashion, if it's biological in nature. And so if you have a cell, like algae, as an example, you can program that cell to produce things. And the reason why we use algae as opposed to using like other forms of bacteria or plants or animals or whatever is because not only is it like the simplest form of life, it's really, really simple. It's really simple to engineer. It's really simple to use. It also creates its own food. It takes from the sun and it takes from salts in the water. And then that's all it really needs to grow. And so using that, you can produce in incredibly low resource environments, like in space, in developing countries, out on a seastead, in the middle of nowhere, in a new city, on an army base, underneath the water in a submarine. In those sort of environments, you can produce it on your desktop in your own home. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for, is being able to produce the basic components, the fundamental ingredients that go into a working society, using different kinds of algae.
I hate to be that guy who always says centralization for everything, but it seems like you're trying to decentralize gene therapies using algae, or what in general. It
Right,
sounds like the
right.
thesis.
Yeah, there's a philosophy around like edible gene therapies, being able to produce stuff like insulin in your own home, being able to open up possibilities of like topical ointments, or the different sorts of medicines, different sorts of foods, different kinds of dyes, clothing. You can do all sorts of variety of different things, and the decentralization really comes into play, where you have more of a post-scarcity sort of world, where you don't have to worry about going to a centralized hub to produce the things that you need. You can produce it yourself if you really want to.
Well, it's good to have a hub in a certain aspect. I mean, that's why you're in a co-living space with people. You
Right.
can bump into other people and interchange human capital.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. There is a certain value to it, and like where we're at right now in terms of our company development. I mean, we've just hit a really great inflection point in terms of revenue. We're raising a seed round. We have the team; it's growing, expanding. We just got a grant from the National Science Foundation. I came back from this moon mission. Lots of things are happening and changing, and we're in a kind of like hub and spoke model. So I work with 22 farms across the world. I think 7 or 8 different countries, and they ship us our algae here, which we process it here. Pretty soon, what we'll start shifting to is more of a land and expand, where it becomes decentralized nodes near our farms, producing localized production of the kind of ingredients that we're talking about. And then beyond that, like the aim is more local production. Local production really enables stuff like food security and resiliency of local economies and environments, where you really don't have to seek access outside of what you're doing. You have the ability to produce the things that you need locally. And so in a startup society's frame, that really enables new cities to pop up all over the place without needing to really resort to specialization or trade. You still have the ability to specialize, especially if you have a pertinent skill or economic value. But rather than extracting value or resources from a given environment, you can really create it virtually anywhere on Earth.
This really ties into, and it's very interesting how it sort of ties organically, no pun intended, into all the different veins of startup societies. In this case, it'd be intentional communities and eco villages. There's some people who want to be, with their own food and not have to rely as much. And I think maybe a year ago, all of us would have thought maybe it's a little bit crazy. But after the lack of ability for the system to withstand large shocks, maybe it's not so crazy to want to grow your own food source and be a little self-reliant in the case that, all things come crashing down, or at least becoming significantly hard.
Right. I mean, there's 2 things that I can say to that in relation to the pandemic. So the first is, as soon as stuff started going wrong and there was a run on supermarkets, my team doubled down and started growing algae at scale again. And so we, just in the event of an apocalyptic scenario, or when you're cut off from supply chains, you have a local food source, a protein dense food source, where you're able to exist on something like that. So, I mean, I've talked with a number of researchers from like the Center for Existential Risk, and in the event of like a nuclear apocalypse or like an asteroid hitting the Earth, or like a pandemic scenario, or really bad things happening, what you want to do is have more decentralized nodes of production as a means of supporting yourself. So we were doing things like growing algae. We were producing kind of kombucha scobies as a means of replacing toilet paper, which is a really dumb idea. I don't recommend it. And then producing alcohol as kind of like a bartering tool, and hand sanitizer, you know? So trying to figure out different ways to produce the things that you need. And as a good Virginian, I knew I needed to brew some alcohol. And then the second thing related to the pandemic is that there's a team of biohackers, of synthetic biologists, biotechnologists that operate in these garage laboratories, independent laboratories, that took a look at the pandemic and said, you know, like people always are scared of people in garages coming up with these sort of viruses or other things like that. But really, we're like the good guys. We're the white hat hackers who can help solve these problems. So what they did was they developed new diagnostic tools incredibly quickly, like in the span of a week or two or month, you know, much faster than academic institutions, because the majority of them shut down. And industrial institutions, they just kind of gave it away for free, right? Because for them, it was more important to solve the problem than to make money off of it. It's very open source ethos. And then secondly, more recently, there's news that a biohacker group actually came up with a vaccine themselves, and so was able to develop it and bring that to market. And so these sort of white hat hackers, biohackers, in garage labs, in home labs, you know, they'll really help enable biosecurity as problems like the pandemic become more and more commonplace and pervasive as time goes
on. I almost want to take us down a tangent because I had the horrible thought about a black hat biohacker. But no, another day. But okay, we covered a plethora of things here. I think we're rounding up to our last question. So to answer, to really round it all off, the first question was, you know, what do you have to do with startup societies? And I think in this conversation sort of, you know, gave evidence of why this is related to startup societies. But I want you to answer, in the context of your own career, what do you believe a startup society entrepreneur is?
Ooh, what do I believe a startup society entrepreneur is? I think just based on what I've seen from the community and the activity of the community, as well as some of what I do in collaboration with other members of the community, a startup society entrepreneur is somebody who is very forward thinking, almost to the point of idealism, but who is able to connect that utopian ideal with what is going on right now and how do they actually work towards that utopian ideal. There's somebody who's incredibly diligent at navigating not only the kind of like political machinations of the special economic zones and environments in which they need to operate in order to clear regulatory hurdles, in order to actively work with investors who would double down on spaces like this, but in addition are interdisciplinary in the sense that they draw in a bunch of different ideas, concepts, ethos as a means of pushing for a more equitable and opportunistic world, something where you're able to get access to the things that you need, and the barriers that are set in place by current entrenched systems are not limitations but opportunities. And so I mean, I think Bertrand Russell said it best, that, you know, the best way to reform a system is by creating an entirely new one that makes the former one obsolete. And so I think that's what startup societies entrepreneurs really push to do, is create entirely new systems that make old ones obsolete.
I think you nailed the nail on the head. Basically, it's someone who wants to create a new system, like you, whether it's legal or technological or both, and they don't argue about it. They build it, and you got that in spades, Elliot.
Just build it, man. Just get it out there and build it.
Elliot, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And everyone, join us again on the Startup Societies Foundation podcast.
Thanks so much, Joe.